ice does not shatter. It thaws, drop by drop, until the man who forged your cage kneels to unmake it. What is freedom worth, if not the right to choose the one who once held the key? Our tale opens here. The manor never truly warmed, no matter the season. Even now, with October pressing its grey palm against the tall windows, the cold seemed to live inside the walls themselves, a permanent tenant that no fire could evict. Hermione had learned its habits the way one learns the moods of a difficult animal, where the draughts pooled in the east corridor, which flagstones held frost long past dawn, how the marble of the great staircase drank heat from the soles of her shoes and gave nothing back. She woke each morning before the light did. There was a particular quality to those hours, a hush so complete she could hear the house settling around her, the tick of cooling iron in the grates, the far-off complaint of a shutter loose on its hinge. She would lie still for a moment in the narrow bed in the narrow room they had given her, and in that moment, before memory reasserted its grip, she was almost no one at all. Then her fingers would find the thin band of scar tissue at her left wrist, the place where the registry brand had been burned into her, a serpent devouring a small script of numbers, and the day would return to her whole and unwanted. Property of House Malfoy. Entry 407. She rose. She dressed in the grey wool they permitted her. She went to wake the boy. Scorpius slept the way only very lonely children sleep, curled tight as a fist, one hand always reaching toward the empty half of the mattress, as though, even in dreams, he expected someone to be there and was disappointed anew each night to find they were not. He was 6 now. He had his mother's fairness and his father's mouth, that same fine sculpted line that could go hard so quickly, and Hermione's whole chest ached with the wrongness of it every time she looked at him. A child so small carrying a face already learning how to close. "Good morning, little owl," she murmured, and drew back the heavy drapes. He stirred, blinked, and then he smiled at her, that unguarded, sleep-soft smile that he gave to no one else in the world, and something in Hermione that the law had tried very hard to kill went on stubbornly living. "Is it a lessons day?" he asked. "It is. But first, porridge, and you are going to eat the honey and not simply arrange it into interesting shapes. I made a dragon yesterday. You made a mess yesterday that a dragon might have envied." He laughed. The sound of it filled the vast cold nursery and could not begin to fill it, and Hermione thought, as she thought every single day, that she would burn this entire house to its foundations before she let them take the laughter out of him too. The morning went as mornings went. Porridge, the Latin declensions he hated, and the star charts he loved. A walk along the frost-stiffened gravel of the south terrace, where the topiary had grown ragged because there was no longer a full staff to tend it. Only the skeleton crew of the bound and the broken, moving through their days with downcast eyes. Hermione taught him the names of the constellations that gave his family its cruel little tradition. Scorpius, of course, and Draco, and further off the pale smear of Andromeda, a name she never said aloud in front of anyone but him. "That one," she told him, though the stars were long gone into daylight, "is a whole galaxy, all by itself, millions upon millions of stars. And from here, it looks like nothing but a scratch of chalk. Distance does that. It makes enormous things look small. Does it work backward? He asked. Can small things look enormous? She looked down at him. Yes, she said. Sometimes the small things are the most enormous of all. He slipped his cold hand into hers, and she let him, though touching him where the portraits could see was a risk, and she had learned to weigh every risk like a coin she could not afford to spend. It was mid-afternoon when the wards changed. She felt it before she understood it, a shift in the pressure of the house, the way the air goes taut and metallic before a storm breaks. The candles in the long gallery guttered though there was no wind. The portraits, ordinarily somnolent, roused all at once and turned their painted faces toward the entrance hall, and old Abraxas Malfoy in his gilt frame said, in a voice like grinding stone, "The master has come home." Hermione went very still. Scorpius, beside her at the schoolroom table, went stiller. She watched the change come over the child like frost creeping across glass. The smile she'd spent all morning coaxing to the surface withdrew, folded itself away, vanished. His small shoulders drew up and in. His hands, which a moment before had been busily inking a lopsided phoenix, flattened themselves against the tabletop, and he stared at them as though willing them to be perfectly, invisibly good. "Papa," he whispered, not with joy, with the careful, held-breath dread of a boy who had learned that his father's presence was a kind of weather one simply survived. It had been 4 months. 4 months since Draco Malfoy had last darkened these halls, and even then only for a night, arriving after dark and gone before the boy had woken, leaving nothing behind but the scent of cold rain and expensive smoke, and the memory of a shut door. Hermione's own body had its own reaction, one she despised. Her spine straightened without her permission. Her chin came up, some ancient animal part of her, the part that had once stood in a firelit drawing room in this very house and refused to scream, braced itself. She heard the doors of the entrance hall thrown open far below. She heard the ring of boot heels on marble, unhurried, precise, a sound with no kindness in it. She heard the murmur of the steward's voice, and no answer given. And then the footsteps began to climb. Scorpius. She crouched to the boy's level, took his chin gently in her hand, made him look at her. "Whatever else happens, you have done nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing. You are a good boy, and you are loved." His eyes, grey as his father's, searched her face for the trick in it. There was no trick. After a moment, he gave a small, grave nod, and it broke her heart the way it broke every day, cleanly, along the same old fault line. The footsteps reached the landing. The schoolroom door was already open. He filled it without seeming to try. 6 years, and the war and whatever the wide, cruel world had done to him in between had pared Draco Malfoy down to something harder than the boy she remembered. He had always been fine-boned, sharp. Now there was a gauntness to him, a severity. The fair hair swept back without vanity and threaded at the temple with the first faint silver. He wore travelling black. His face was a shuttered house, and his eyes, those pale, restless, unreadable eyes, moved once around the room, cataloguing it before they came to rest on her. The temperature of the air seemed to drop. Hermione rose slowly from her crouch and stood between him and his son, and she did not lower her gaze, though the registry demanded that she should. It was a small defiance. It was the only kind she had left. "Malfoy," she said. Something flickered across his features, there and gone, too fast to name. His jaw tightened, a muscle leaping once beneath the pale skin. His hand, gloved in black leather, flexed at his side, and then went still with visible effort. Granger. Her name in his mouth was a thing he handled at arm's length, as if it might stain the glove. I see the household has not improved its manners in my absence. I wasn't aware manners were required, she said, for the property to address its owner. The word property landed between them like a dropped blade. She had chosen it deliberately. She watched it strike. For a moment, just a moment, his composure fractured. The colour left his face and then returned to it, too hot along the cheekbones. His gaze dropped involuntarily to her left wrist, to the sleeve that hid the mark he himself had put there, and his throat moved as he swallowed whatever he had meant to say. Then the shutters came down again, and his voice, when it came, was smooth and terrible and empty. "Where is my son?" Scorpius did not move. He was doing that thing children do when they wish to be furniture, sitting so still, breathing so quietly that the world might overlook them. Hermione felt the boy's fear like heat against her back. "He's here," she said. "He's been at his lessons. He can recite the whole of the astronomy primer, and he's begun on conversational French. And this morning he identified the entire Draco constellation without a single prompt from—" I did not ask for a report. Draco's eyes had not left her. I asked where he was. She stepped aside. She hated that she stepped aside, but she stepped aside because to make the boy the ground of a battle was a cruelty she would not commit. And so she moved and let father look upon son across the width of the cold, bright room. Scorpius lifted his face. For the length of one held breath, the whole house seemed to lean in, the portraits watching, the candles trembling, Hermione's own heart loud in her ears. And she saw the boy's grey eyes lift to his father's grey eyes, saw the desperate flicker of hope surface in that small face. Despite everything, despite 4 months of nothing, despite a lifetime of shut doors. Look at me, please, this time. And Draco Malfoy looked at his son the way a man looks at a piece of unwelcome mail. "He's grown," he said flatly to Hermione, as though the child could not hear. "See that he's presentable at dinner. I'll be in the East Study and I am not to be disturbed." He turned to go. Something rose in Hermione's throat, hot and reckless and entirely without survival instinct, and before she could swallow it down, it was already in the air between them. "He waited for you," she said. Draco stopped. He did not turn around. She watched the long line of his back go rigid, watched the gloved hand at his side curl slowly into a fist, the leather creaking, and for a long moment, the only sound in the world was the guttering of the candles and a child trying very hard not to be heard breathing. "Every night," Hermione went on, quiet, relentless, "he leaves half his bed empty, in case." The fist at his side tightened until the leather groaned. His head turned a fraction, enough to show her the hard, clean edge of his profile, the muscle working in his jaw, the eyes fixed on the middle distance as though something there had wounded him. His mouth opened. Whatever he had been about to say, he did not say it. He closed his mouth. He walked out of the room without another word, and his boot heels rang away down the corridor, unhurried, precise, and did not falter once. Except, Hermione would swear to herself later, for a single missed beat at the top of the stairs, one small stumble in that perfect cold rhythm, gone so quickly she might have imagined it, before the great house swallowed the sound of him entirely. Dinner was served in the small dining room, which was small only by the standards of a house that measured its rooms against ballrooms. The table could have seated 20. It seated 2, with a stretch of dark polished oak between them, long enough that a spoken word had to travel to arrive. And Hermione stood in the shadowed alcove by the sideboard where the governess belonged, near enough to tend the child, far enough to be forgotten, and watched a father and son eat in a silence so total it had a texture, a grain, like the tooth of old parchment under the fingertips. Scorpius sat very straight in his chair. He had been scrubbed and combed and buttoned into the dove-grey coat that Hermione had let out twice already this year, and he held his fork the way she had taught him, and he did not spill, and he did not speak, and every few moments his eyes crept up the length of the table toward the man at its head, and every few moments they crept back down to his plate, having found there nothing at all. Draco ate without appearing to taste. He had shed the travelling black for a shirt the colour of ash, and he sat with the unconscious ease of a man who had never in his life wondered whether he was permitted to be somewhere. The candlelight did him no favours, and needed to do none. It found the sharp architecture of his face, and made it sharper, pooled in the hollows beneath his cheekbones, caught the pale disorder of his hair. A single silver ring sat on his right hand, and now and then it clicked against the crystal of his glass when he drank, a small cold sound in the enormous quiet. Hermione had counted, without meaning to, the number of times the man had looked at his son. Twice, in half an hour. And both times only when he believed the boy's attention was elsewhere. A swift, unreadable flick of the eyes, gone the instant Scorpius stirred, as though to be caught looking would cost him something he could not afford to spend. She could not bear it. She had told herself, in the 4 months of his absence, all the sensible things, that the child was not her child, that she was a name in a book, that the surest way to survive this house was to make herself its shadow, to want nothing, to feel nothing, to become as smooth and cold and unremarkable as the marble under her feet. She had told herself these things, and she had almost believed them, and now the man had been under this roof for the length of a single meal, and every sensible resolution in her was cracking like ice on a thawing pond. "He drew you a phoenix," she said. The words dropped into the silence and detonated there. Scorpius went rigid. Draco's fork stilled against the china with a soft click. "I beg your pardon." Draco did not raise his head. "This afternoon, before you arrived." Hermione stepped out of her alcove. 1 step, only one, but it felt like stepping off a cliff. He'd been drawing all morning. A phoenix, because I'd told him a story about one. He wanted it to be finished for you. He wanted to show you. Across the table, Scorpius had gone the colour of the tablecloth. His small hands had found each other in his lap and were gripping hard, and he was staring at Hermione with an expression of purest betrayal and terror, because she had exposed his hope, dragged the tender secret thing of it out into the cold air of this room, and she felt the wrongness of that even as she did it. and could not stop, because the alternative, the silence, the two of them sitting there like strangers at a wake, was a thing she could not, would not, allow to stand unbroken for one more moment. Draco set down his fork. He raised his eyes, and for the first time all evening, he looked directly at his son. The boy withered under it. He seemed to fold, to grow smaller in the great carved chair, and Hermione's heart broke to watch him brace for whatever was coming. And she was already moving, already opening her mouth to draw the fire onto herself where it belonged. "Is that so?" Draco said. His voice was flat, but it was not cruel. It was something worse than cruel. It was careful, held rigid, a voice with all its weight pressed down on top of something that was trying very hard to rise. Scorpius did not answer. Could not, perhaps. He gave the smallest nod, a fraction of a movement, his eyes fixed on his plate. "And where?" Draco said in that same terrible, careful tone. "Is this Phoenix now?" A silence. Then, in a whisper so small it barely reached the length of the table. "I didn't finish it." "Why not?" The boy's chin trembled. "Because you came home." A pause, and then the rest of it came out in a rush, helpless, the way the truth comes out of children before they have learned to armor it. "And I got too happy to hold the pen right, and I smudged the wing. And I didn't want to give you a smudged one, so I hid it." The quiet after that was a living thing. Hermione watched Draco Malfoy's face, and she watched it undo itself, slowly, against his will, in increments too small for the boy to see, but not for her. The muscle in his jaw, the whitening around his mouth. His right hand had come to rest flat on the table, the silver ring catching the light. And now the fingers of it curled inward, one by one, until the hand was a fist pressed against the dark wood, the knuckles bloodless, and Hermione understood with a lurch of something she had no name for that this was not anger. That she had spent 6 years reading his stillness as coldness, and she had been, in some fundamental way, wrong. He did not know how to do this. That was what she was seeing. The man had every weapon in the world at his disposal, a name, a wand, a law that had reshaped the earth in his family's favor. And he sat at the head of his own table, utterly disarmed by 6 words from a 6-year-old. And he did not have the first idea what to do with the wreckage of his own child's hope. And so he sat there, fist clenched, mouth white, and said nothing at all. The silence stretched to the breaking point. And then Scorpius, who had learned long ago that his father's silences were doors closing, pushed back his chair. "May I be excused?" he said. It was not a question. It was a retreat, dressed in the manners Hermione had taught him. "Scorpius," she began. "Yes," Draco said. The boy fled. Not running. He was too well schooled for that. But walking very fast, his small back rigid, his head down, out through the door and away down the corridor toward the nursery and the safety of a bed with one empty side. And Hermione stood in the ringing aftermath of it, with her hands in fists at her own sides, and turned on the man at the table with 6 years of banked fury rising in her throat like floodwater breaching a dam. "He hid a drawing," she said, low and shaking, "because he could not bear to disappoint you with a smudge. Do you understand what that means?" Do you have any conception of what it costs a child to love a person that carefully? Draco did not look at her. He was staring at the place where his son had been. You will not raise your voice to me in this house, he said. But the words had no force in them. They were a reflex, a shape his mouth made, and they died in the air between them. Then throw me in the registry cells. Hermione's voice cracked, and she let it. Add it to the ledger. Insubordination, entry 407. You've done worse to me for less. That reached him. His head came up, and the look on his face when his eyes found hers was not the shuttered mask of the afternoon. It was raw, stripped, and for one vertiginous second she was looking straight through the man into whatever lived behind him. And what lived behind him was so full of a grief, she had not expected that she took an involuntary step back, her hips striking the edge of the sideboard, the crystal decanters chiming softly at the jolt. Yes, he said, very quietly, I have done worse to you for less. The admission hung there, unspeakable, unretractable. Neither of them moved. The candles burned low in their silver throats. Somewhere in the vast, dark house, a clock counted out the seconds, and the rain that had been threatening all day finally arrived against the tall windows, a sudden hushing rush of it, the first fat drops giving way to a steady silver curtain that blurred the black gardens beyond the glass into nothing. Draco rose from the table. He did it slowly, unfolding to his full height, and he stood there with one hand braced on the dark oak and the other at his side, and he looked at Hermione Granger across the ruins of a dinner no one had eaten, and something moved behind his eyes that was neither cruelty nor command. You've done something to him, he said. She lifted her chin. I've loved him since he had no one else to. The words struck him visibly. He flinched, the whole of him, a flinch too deep to hide. And his gaze dropped again to her wrist, to the sleeve, to the mark beneath the sleeve, and his mouth opened and closed. When his mother died, Hermione went on, because she had started now and she could not stop, because 6 years of silence were pouring out of her in the rain-loud dark. He was 4 days old, 4 days, and you handed him to a servant and you rode away, and you have been riding away ever since, and every night the child leaves half his bed empty for a father who cannot look at him for the length of a meal. So, yes, I've done something to him. I have been the something you refused to be. For a long moment, Draco Malfoy said nothing. Then he crossed the room. He crossed it in 3 long strides, faster than she could brace for, and Hermione's heart lurched into her throat because she did not know. Even now, even after everything, she did not know what this man would do. And she held her ground, because holding her ground was the last thing she owned. And he stopped an arm's length from her, close enough that she could see the rain light moving on his face and the storm moving behind his eyes, close enough that she could smell the cold and the smoke and something underneath it that was only him. You think I cannot look at him, he said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. You think it is coldness. What else would I call it? You have no idea, he breathed, how much easier it would be if it were. And he lifted his hand, the right hand, the silver ring catching the last of the candlelight. And for one suspended, breathless instant, Hermione was certain he meant to touch her. and every nerve in her body drew tight as a wire, and she did not step away, and neither of them was breathing, and the rain came down and down against the glass, and his hand hovered in the charged and narrow space between them, trembling very slightly, close enough now that she could feel the warmth coming off his skin. And then, with a visible act of will that seemed to cost him everything he had, he let it fall back to his side, curled it into a fist, and turned and walked out into the dark of the house, leaving her standing alone in the candlelight, with her heart slamming against her ribs and the taste of the storm on her tongue. She did not sleep that night, and neither, she suspected, did he. Twice she heard footsteps in the corridor beyond her door, that unhurried, precise tread she would have known anywhere, and twice they passed and did not stop, and twice she lay rigid in the narrow bed with her heart in her throat, until the sound of them faded into the house's larger silence. The rain kept up its steady work against the window all through the small hours, and Hermione watched the grey light come slowly into the room and thought about a hand that had hovered and had not fallen and could not make the memory lie down and be still. In the morning, she found the drawing. She had gone to the schoolroom before waking the boy to lay the fire and set out his primers, and there on the long table where he had abandoned it in yesterday's terror lay the phoenix, half finished, one wing smudged where an over-happy hand had dragged the wet ink, the other wing rendered with the fierce, laborious care of a child who loved the thing he was making. She stood over it a long moment. Then she heard the door. Draco stood in the threshold in the grey shirt from the night before, unslept, his jaw shadowed, and his eyes went past her to the drawing on the table and stopped there and did not move. Neither of them spoke. He crossed the room slowly. He did not look at her. He came to the table and he stood over the smudged phoenix, and he looked down at it with an expression she could not read because he would not let her read it. And after a long moment, he reached out one finger and touched, very lightly, the ruined wing, the place his son had been ashamed of, and Hermione watched his throat move as he swallowed. "He has a good hand," Draco said. His voice was rough with the night. "For his age." "He has a better heart," said Hermione. The finger stilled against the parchment. Draco's eyes closed, briefly, and when they opened again, he took his hand away and straightened, and the shutters were coming down over his face. She could see them descending, and she could not let them. She found she simply could not let them. Not this morning, not after that hovering hand. "Teach me," she said. He turned. "What?" "You keep away from him because you don't know how to be near him. I've watched you do it for 6 years, and I finally understand it. It isn't that you don't feel it, it's that you feel it so much you've decided the kindest thing is to stay out of his sight." She took a breath. "You're wrong, but I understand it. So let me teach you. Come to his lessons. Sit in the corner and say nothing if you must, but be in the room." For a long moment she thought he would refuse. She watched the reflex of refusal move across him, the tightening, the withdrawal, the old cold armor reaching for its buckles. And then, from the doorway, in a small, uncertain voice, came the sound of his son. "Papa?" Scorpius stood barefoot in the corridor in his nightshirt, hair sleep-wild, and he was looking at his father standing over the abandoned drawing with an expression of such careful, terrified hope that the whole room seemed to hold its breath around it. The boy's eyes went from Draco's face to the phoenix and back, and understanding dawned in them slowly. He found it, he saw the smudge, he's angry, and he began instinctively to fold himself smaller. Draco looked at the drawing in his hand, then he looked at his son, and Hermione watched Draco Malfoy do the hardest thing she had ever seen him do, which was to cross a room toward a child who was braced to be hurt and lower himself, awkwardly, stiffly, a man who had never once in 6 years put himself below his own son's eyeline, down onto one knee on the cold flagstones so that his face was level with the boy's. "This is very fine work," he said. He held up the phoenix. His voice was not steady, and he did not try to make it steady. "The wing here, the way you've done the flames rising off it. I have seen grown men paint worse and charge gold for it." Scorpius stared at him. "It's smudged," he whispered. "Yes," Draco said. "It's smudged." He turned the parchment so the boy could see the ruined wing. "Do you know what this looks like to me? It looks like a bird moving, a phoenix that is too full of fire to hold still for its portrait. That is not a mistake, Scorpius. That is the best part." The boy's lower lip trembled. His eyes filled and spilled over silently, the way children cry when they have learned that crying loudly is unsafe, and Hermione had to press her own hand hard against her mouth to keep her own composure, standing there by the cold hearth, watching 6 years break open in a single morning. "I hid it," Scorpius said, "because I didn't want you to be, because I thought you would." "I know." Draco's own voice broke on it, cleanly, and he did not disguise the break. "I know what you thought, and you were right to think it, and I'm sorry for that. I am sorry that you learned to think it." He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement the way one moves near a frightened animal, and he laid his hand, the hand with the silver ring, against the side of his son's small head, cupping the sleep-wild hair, and the boy went still under the touch, as though he could not believe in it. "I was away," Draco said, low, "for a long time, and I told myself I was away because it was safer for you. That was a lie I told myself, so I would not have to tell you a harder truth, which is that I did not know how to look at you without seeing everything I have lost. That was cowardice. It was not your fault. It was never, not once, your fault. Do you understand me?" Scorpius did not understand. How could he, at 6? But he understood the hand in his hair and the wet in his father's eyes. And he did the only thing a child can do with a grief that large, which was to step forward into it and press his face against his father's chest. And Draco Malfoy caught his son and folded around him and held on. Hermione turned away toward the window so that neither of them would see her face. The rain had stopped in the night. The gardens beyond the glass were washed and dripping and grey. The ragged topiary hung with silver, and the first thin line of sun was breaking somewhere far out over the eastern woods, and she stood with her back to the room and her hand at her mouth, and let the tears run, because she had prayed for this every night for 6 years without ever once believing it would come. And now it had come, and it was almost more than she could bear. Behind her, she heard the boy's muffled voice. "Will you stay?" And she heard the father's answer, rough and quiet and certain. "I will stay." They did not speak of it afterward, she and Draco. There was no speaking of it. The thing was too large and too new, and to put words to it would have been to risk it. But he came to the lessons. He came that very afternoon, and he sat in the corner as she had told him he might, in a wing-backed chair too small for the vast schoolroom. And he said nothing for the first hour, only watched her draw the boy through his declensions, watched her make a game of the star charts, watched the way Scorpius unfolded under attention like something long kept in the dark finding light. And Hermione was aware of his eyes on her the entire time, a warmth against the side of her face, like standing near a fire. And she taught badly for the first quarter hour, fumbling words she had known for years, until she made herself stop noticing him, and could not stop noticing him, and simply carried on regardless. By the second hour, he was leaning forward in the too small chair. By the third, he had corrected the boy's French, gently, a single word, the accent on a vowel. And Scorpius had looked up at his father with an expression of such uncomplicated delight at being spoken to that Hermione had to busy herself abruptly with the fire. It became, over the following days, a habit none of them named. Draco at the lessons, Draco at the meals, at the foot of the small table no longer, but drawn up close, near enough that the boy could reach him. Draco on the frost-stiff gravel of the south terrace in the pale afternoons, learning the constellations from his own son, who recited them proudly and got them mostly right, and was corrected without shame. And through all of it, running underneath it like a current under ice, was the other thing. The thing that had begun the first night with a hand that hovered and did not fall. She caught him looking at her. She caught him at it more than once, and it was never the flat appraising look of an owner cataloguing his property. It was something searching, something baffled, the look of a man reading a word in a language he thought he had forgotten, and finding that he still knew it. And each time she caught him, he did not look away as a guilty man looks away. He held her gaze for one beat too long, one deliberate beat, before he turned back to whatever he had been doing, and the beat was a message. And she did not know what it said, and she lay awake at night trying to translate it. One evening, a week into his return, she was carrying a lamp through the long gallery on her way to the nursery, when she found him standing before the portrait of his late wife. Astoria Malfoy looked down out of her gilt frame, fair and delicate, and already even in paint, wearing the pallor of the illness that had taken her. Draco stood before her with his hands clasped behind his back, and he did not hear Hermione approach, and for a moment she saw him wholly unguarded, the grief in the set of his shoulders, the exhaustion, the loneliness of a man standing in a mausoleum he had built and could not leave. She should have withdrawn. She did not withdraw. She was kind, Hermione said quietly. He did not turn. You knew her. A little. Before the war, before the law, before the world had rearranged itself into masters and registries. She used to bring books back to the library herself, rather than have a servant do it. She'd stay and talk. She wasn't like... Hermione stopped. Like me, Draco finished. There was no bitterness in it, only fact. I was going to say she wasn't like the rest of this house. He turned then, and the lamplight caught his face, and his eyes found hers across the narrow gallery, and the air between them drew tight and static, the way it had drawn tight the first night in the dining room, a tension with a pull in it now, a magnetism she had stopped pretending she could not feel. He looked at her for a long moment, the portrait of his dead wife watching over them both. "No," he said softly, "she wasn't, and neither, it seems, are you." And he took a single step toward her across the gallery, and the lamp trembled in Hermione's hand, sending the shadows swinging wild across the walls, across the painted face above them, across the narrow, charged space between two people who had spent 6 years as owner and owned and were becoming, in the rain-washed autumn dark of that terrible, beautiful house, something for which neither of them yet had a name. The step he took was never finished. A sound broke the spell, the far, thin wail of a child crying out in his sleep, carrying down the length of the gallery from the nursery beyond, and both of them turned toward it at once, the tension shattering like dropped crystal, and Hermione was already moving, the lamp swinging, the shadows reeling across the walls, and Draco was a half-pace behind her, all the way down the corridor. Scorpius was thrashing in his bed, tangled in the sheets, his face slick and his fair hair plastered to his forehead. He was hot to the touch when Hermione reached him. Burning, the fever risen out of nowhere the way children's fevers do, a normal childhood thing that Hermione had weathered a dozen times. But she felt Draco go rigid beside her all the same, felt the fear come off him like cold off a window, and she understood, without being told, that the last small body he had watched burn with fever had been his wife's. "It's a fever," she said quickly, laying the back of her hand against the boy's cheek, his throat. "A child's fever. He's had them before. Draco, look at me. He's had them before, and they've always broken by morning. This is not that. Do you hear me? This is not that." He heard her. Some of the terror left his eyes. But he did not leave the room, and Hermione did not ask him to. They worked over the child together through the long hours of the night. She sponged him cool with cloths wrung out in basin water. Draco held the boy up against his own chest when the coughing came, murmuring low nonsense against the fever-damp hair, a tenderness in him that 6 years of ice had never let her see. She fetched the tincture from the medicine cabinet and measured it by lamplight. He coaxed it past the boy's cracked lips with a patience she would not have believed him capable of a week before. And in the small hours, when Scorpius finally slid down into a true sleep, his breathing evened and his skin gone cool and dewy with the broken fever, they sat on either side of his bed in the guttering light and looked at each other across the small sleeping shape of him, and neither of them had the strength left to pretend. "You were right," Draco said. His voice was hoarse. "It broke. They usually do." "I never knew that." He said it simply, without self-pity, a man stating the measure of what he had missed. "I never knew any of it, whether they broke by morning, what one does, how much water. I have signed treaties and I have commanded men, and I did not know how much water to give my own son. You know now." "I know now," he agreed. He looked down at the boy. Then he looked up at her, and the lamplight was low and gold between them, and the house was silent all around, and the exhaustion had worn the last of his armor away. "You have done a thing for him, Granger, that I will not be able to repay if I live to be 100. You have to know that I know that. Hermione's throat was tight. I didn't do it to be repaid. I know that too. That is rather the point. The silence that came then was not the frozen silence of the dining room a week ago. It was a warm silence, a tired and intimate silence. The silence of two people who have kept a vigil together and come out the far side of it. And Hermione was aware, across the sleeping child, of the whole weight of the man's attention resting on her, and of how little she wished it to move away. "Why did you do it?" she asked. He tilted his head. 6 years ago. She had to force it out. Her heart was hammering. You had every Muggle-born in the country to choose from, once the registry was, once the law took them. You could have taken anyone. You could have taken no one. Why me? Why the library and then the boy? Why not the cells like the others? For a long moment she thought he would not answer. His jaw worked. His hand, resting on the coverlet near his son's foot, curled slowly closed. "Because you would not scream," he said. She stared at him. "In the drawing room." His voice had dropped very low, and he did not look at her. He looked at the sleeping boy, at his own closed hand. "During the war, when my aunt, you remember. Of course you remember." His knuckles whitened. "You would not scream. She did everything a person can do to another person to make them scream, and you would not give it to her. And I stood against the wall and I watched, and I did nothing, and I have watched it every night since in 100 dreams I cannot wake from." He drew a slow breath. "When the law came and the registry opened, I told myself I was claiming an asset. A rare book, a clever mind, a thing of value for the library. That was the lie. The truth was that I could not bear the thought of what would happen to you in the cells, and I had exactly one power in the world large enough to prevent it, and it was the power to own you." His hand opened, slowly, and lay flat and defeated on the coverlet. "So, I owned you. I told myself it was mercy. I made you kneel and swear service, and I told myself it was mercy, and it was the most monstrous thing I have ever done, and I have not been able to look at you straight since, and I have not been able to stay in this house because you are in it, and every time I see you, I see the drawing room, and I see myself doing nothing, and then I see myself putting a brand on your wrist and calling it kindness." The confession fell into the quiet room and lay there. Hermione could not speak. 6 years of a story she had told herself about him. Cold, cruel, indifferent, a man who had chained her out of contempt, was tilting and reordering itself in the low gold light, and the truth underneath it was so much worse and so much more human that she did not know what to do with it. Her eyes had filled. She let them. "That doesn't make it right," she said at last, and her voice shook. "None of that makes it right. You know that. I know that." He met her eyes then, and there was no plea in his, no request for absolution, only the flat, terrible steadiness of a man who has finally said the thing aloud. "I am not asking you to forgive it. It is not a forgivable thing. I am telling you, because you asked, and because you of all people have earned the truth, and because—" He stopped. "Because what?" "Because I am so tired," he said very quietly, "of you thinking it was contempt." The lamp guttered. Somewhere far off in the great sleeping house, a clock struck the hour, 4 slow tolls, and neither of them moved. Between them, the child slept on, cool and peaceful, his small hand curled open on the pillow, and Hermione looked at the father of that child across the narrow lamplit space and felt the last of her old certainties fall away. "I used to hate you," she said. "For years. It was very simple. It got me through. You should hate me. It is the correct response." "I know." She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. "But it isn't simple anymore. I watched you kneel on a cold floor to look your son in the eye. I watched you hold him up while he coughed and call him brave. And now you've told me this." She gestured helplessly between them, at the confession still hanging in the air. "And I can't make it simple again. I've tried sitting here for the last hour. I can't get it back." Something moved across his face. Not hope. He did not dare hope. She could see him refusing to let himself hope. But something. "Then what is it now?" he asked. "If it is not simple?" "I don't know." It was the truth. "I don't know what it is now." He held her gaze across the child. The lamplight lay along the sharp planes of his face and softened them. The exhaustion had made him young, or had made him honest, which on him amounted to nearly the same thing. And Hermione was seized by the sudden vertiginous awareness of how close they were sitting, how the vigil had drawn them in over the hours until their shoulders were nearly level across the small bed, how she could see the individual fair lashes lowered over his grey eyes and the pulse beating at the base of his throat. "You should sleep," she made herself say. "He'll wake early. He always does after." "I'm not tired." "You're exhausted." "Yes," he agreed, not moving. "I am exhausted. I have been exhausted for 6 years. It is a different thing from being tired." He looked at her, and his voice, when it came again, was so low it was nearly nothing. "I don't want to leave this room, Granger. I have spent 6 years finding reasons to leave every room you were in, and I am too tired tonight to find another one, and I don't want to. That is all. You needn't do anything with it. I only did not want to lie to you again by pretending otherwise." Hermione's heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it in the silence. She should have stood. She should have taken the lamp and gone to her narrow bed and let the night close the door it had opened. That was the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing that survival had taught her over 6 long years of walking the knife's edge of this house. She knew it the way she knew her own name. She did not stand. She stayed where she was, on the low chair by the sleeping child, in the failing light, and she looked at Draco Malfoy across his son and let him look at her, and the silence stretched between them warm and enormous and unbroken. And outside the tall window, the black autumn night wheeled slowly toward a dawn that neither of them was ready to meet. And when at last her hand moved, slowly, across the coverlet into the small space between their two bodies, it was not toward the lamp, and she watched his eyes follow it, and she watched him understand, and she watched his own hand begin, with infinite care, as though she was something that might break or bolt to move to meet it. Their fingers met over the coverlet, and neither of them breathed. It was the barest touch, the pads of his fingers grazing the backs of hers, a warmth, a tremor passing between the 2 points of contact like static leaping a gap. And yet, Hermione felt it travel the whole length of her arm and settle somewhere beneath her ribs a small, unbearable heat. Draco went very still, as if any larger movement might frighten the moment into flight. His fingers curled slowly, and hers curled to meet them, and there, in the failing lamplight, across the body of his sleeping son, their two hands folded together and held on. He looked at their joined hands as though he could not quite believe in them. Then he looked at her. "Granger," he said, low. "Hermione," she corrected, before she could think better of it. If this is, then it's Hermione." Something broke open in his face. "Hermione," he repeated, and her name in his mouth was nothing at all like it had been the first night, when he had held it at arm's length like a soiled thing. Now he handled it as if it were the most fragile object in the house. They did not kiss. Not then. It would have been too much, too fast, a thing that might have collapsed under its own weight in the fever-worn small hours. And some deep wisdom in both of them knew it. And so they only sat, hands clasped over the sleeping child, and let the dawn come up grey and slow beyond the tall window. And when at last the first true light touched the room, and Scorpius stirred toward waking, they let go of each other by silent mutual accord, and the loss of that warmth was its own kind of ache, and Hermione carried it with her all through the ordinary business of the morning, like a coal held cupped against the cold. For 3 days, the house existed in a state of suspended enchantment. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. It lived in the spaces between, in the way his hand would find the small of her back for half a second as they passed in a doorway, a touch gone before it fully arrived. In the way she began to save the last of the good tea for the hour after the boy was abed, and he began, without either of them arranging it, to appear in the library at that hour. In the long charged silences that were no longer the silences of owner and owned, but of two people learning the shape of a thing too new to name. The autumn deepened toward winter outside the walls. The first hard frost came and glazed the gardens white, and Scorpius, wholly recovered and radiant with a happiness he had never known, ran shrieking through it while his father watched from the terrace with an expression Hermione had to keep looking away from because it undid her every time. And then, on the 4th day, the wards changed again. Not the familiar shift of the master returning. Something colder, more official, a knocking against the house's defences from outside, a pressure with the weight of the law behind it. Hermione felt it in the schoolroom and went cold to her core because she knew that pressure. Every subjugated soul in Britain knew that pressure, and she was already reaching for Scorpius when Draco appeared in the doorway with his face gone white and rigid and the old shutters slamming down over it all at once. "Registry inspection," he said. "Take the boy to the nursery. Now." "Draco." "Now, Hermione. Please." The please was cracked, urgent, and it moved her more than any command could have. "Whatever you hear, whatever they say to me, do not come down. Do you understand? Keep him upstairs and keep him quiet, and do not, under any circumstance, let them see your face." She understood. God help her. She understood exactly. An inspector who took an interest in a registered Muggle-born could requisition her on the spot, reassign her, remove her to the cells, do with her whatever the law's cold machinery decided. And a governess grown too familiar with the family, a subjugated woman who did not keep her eyes down, was precisely the sort of irregularity such men were paid to notice. She took the boy upstairs. She sat with him on the nursery floor and built him a fort of cushions and told him a story in a low, steady voice. And all the while, her ears strained down through the floors of the house toward the sound of boots in the entrance hall, toward the murmur of a stranger's voice, toward the answering murmur of Draco's, gone smooth and cold and terrible again, the voice of the man he had to be. She could not hear the words. She could hear the tone. She heard it go on for a long time, too long. And she heard once the inspector's voice rise sharp with what might have been suspicion. And she heard Draco's answer come back level and easy and lethally bored, the drawl of a pureblood lord who could not conceive of being questioned in his own home. And she pressed her hand to her mouth and held the boy against her and prayed to nothing at all. And then she heard her name. Or rather, she heard her number, entry 407, spoken by the stranger's voice, and heard the rustle of the ledger, and heard the inspector say something about a reassignment, about a shortage of registered library staff at the ministry archive, about how a mind like the one described in these records was wasted keeping a country house. And Hermione's blood turned to ice water in her veins, because she knew what came next. She had seen it happen to others, the polite, bloodless theft of a person from one place to another, as though they were a book being recalled to a different shelf. She did not hear Draco's answer. There was a silence. And then his voice came back, and it was different. It had gone quiet, dangerously, absolutely quiet. And though she could not make out the words, she could hear the thing underneath them, the pure, cold ferocity of it. And she heard the inspector's voice falter, and she heard Draco say something short and final, and she heard, unmistakably, the sound of a large sum of gold being counted out onto a hard surface, coin after coin after coin, an obscene amount, a fortune. And she understood that he was buying it, that he was paying whatever it cost, that he was spending his family's cold accumulated wealth to keep a stranger from carrying her out of this house. When the boots finally rang back across the entrance hall and out through the great doors, when the wards released their pressure and the house exhaled, Hermione was already moving. She left the boy safe in his cushion fort with a promise and flew down the great staircase, and she found Draco standing alone in the vast cold entrance hall, one hand braced against the marble balustrade, his head bowed, his shoulders rising and falling too fast. Draco. He turned. His face was ashen. His other hand, she saw, was pressed flat against his own chest, as though he were holding something in place, and when he spoke, his voice was not smooth or cold at all. It was ragged, stripped, the voice from the vigil, the voice from the confession. "They wanted to take you," he said. "I heard. To the archive, in London, under ministry warrant." He said it as if he could still not believe the nearness of it. "There is a clause. I did not know there was a clause. Any registered soul with certain qualifications can be requisitioned by the ministry regardless of their holding house, for the good of the state." His mouth twisted on the words. "I bought the exemption. It is a permanent exemption. It cost..." He stopped. "It does not matter what it cost." Hermione crossed the cold hall to him. "It matters. Draco, how much..." "It does not matter." and there was such raw force in it that she stopped, because she saw finally the whole shape of what he was not saying. He had not merely spent money. He had spent it in a way that would be noticed. A Malfoy paying a small fortune to retain one registered governess, in a regime where such things were catalogued, where an interest in the welfare of a subjugated Muggle-born was itself a kind of crime, a softness, a suspect deviation from the cold arithmetic the law demanded. He had put himself on a ledger somewhere. He had made himself, in the eyes of the machine he served, a man with something to hide. "You've exposed yourself," she breathed. "Haven't you? To keep me here." "Yes." "Why?" "You know why." He said it low and fierce, and he pushed off the balustrade and came to stand before her, close, closer than the doorway touches, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes. "You have known why for 4 days, and you have been too kind or too frightened to say it, and so have I. And I am done being frightened. Do you hear me? I watched a stranger open a book and nearly write your name out of my life with a stroke of a quill, and I have never in my life been so." His voice failed. His hand came up and hovered, exactly as it had that first night in the dining room, trembling in the narrow charged space between them, and this time it did not fall. This time his palm came to rest against the side of her face. His hand was cold, and it was shaking, and it cupped her cheek with a tenderness that was almost fear. And Hermione's breath left her in a rush, and she brought her own hand up and pressed it over his, holding it there, holding him there. And they stood in the vast frozen entrance hall of that terrible house, with the winter light falling grey through the high windows, and the ledger of the law still lying open somewhere in the world with her number in it. And Draco Malfoy looked at her as though she were the only warm thing left in all that marble, and he whispered, brokenly, "I cannot keep buying you a place in a cage. I know that. I know it is still a cage. But I could not let them take you, and I did not know how else. I did not know how else to—" And Hermione, who had spent 6 years learning to want nothing and feel nothing, and make herself smooth and cold as the stone around her, rose up onto her toes and stopped his mouth with her own. The kiss was soft, and it was desperate, and it tasted of salt, and his hand slid back into her hair, and hers fisted in the front of his shirt, and for a long, trembling moment there was nothing in the world but the warmth of it, the two of them breathing each other in the cold, ringing hall. And then he made a low, broken sound against her mouth and pulled back just far enough to rest his forehead against hers, both of them shaking, his eyes squeezed shut, and he whispered, "No, not like this. Not while you're still. Not while there is still a brand on your wrist that I put there. I will not have you come to me as a thing I own. When you come to me, if you come to me, it will be as a free woman, or it will not be at all." And Hermione stared up at him with her heart cracking open and her fingers still knotted in his shirt, understanding at last what he meant to do, understanding it a heartbeat before he said it, as his hands came up to frame her face, and he breathed the impossible, dangerous, world-ending words, "I am going to take you out of that book." It could not be done. That was the first thing she said, when her heart had slowed enough to let her speak, when they had drawn apart in the cold hall, and she had made herself remember that wanting a thing did not make it possible. "You can't take me out of the registry," Hermione said. "No one comes out of the registry. It's a one-way door, Draco. That's the entire design of it. A name goes in, and it never comes out except into the cells or the ground. There is no clause for release. I know the law. I've read every word of it in your own library, looking for exactly the thing you're describing, and it isn't there." "There is no clause for release," Draco agreed. He had drawn her into the small east study and shut the door, and he stood now at the tall window with his back to the frost-white gardens, the winter light behind him turning his fair hair to something colourless and fine. "You're right. There is no legal way out. A registered soul cannot be freed. Then, but a registered soul can die." The word dropped into the warm study and lay there, and Hermione went cold. "What are you saying?" "The registry does not track people," Draco said, and there was a strange controlled excitement moving under his stillness now, the look of a man who had turned a terrible problem over and over in the dark and finally found the one crack in it. "It tracks numbers, entries. 407 is not you, Hermione. It is a line in a ledger, a set of records, a brand keyed to a magical signature. If entry 407 were to be recorded as deceased, if the ledger were amended, the signature discharged, the death certified by the holding house as the law requires and no more, then the number would close. The book would consider its business with you concluded." He held her eyes. "And a woman with no number and no name the ministry is looking for, and papers saying she is someone else entirely, is not a subjugated soul. She is simply a woman, free to go where she likes, free to—" He stopped. Free. Hermione's mind was racing ahead of him, down the corridor he was opening, and she saw the shape of it and the danger of it all at once. "You'd have to falsify a death to the ministry as the holding house. Yes. If they ever discovered it, they would not merely take you back." His voice was flat. "They would take the boy. They would take everything. And they would put me somewhere far worse than a cage." He said it without flinching, laying the whole cost out on the table between them, refusing to hide a single coin of it. "I know exactly what I am proposing, Hermione. I have known for 4 days. I have thought of very little else. It is treason against the law that made my family what it is, and if it fails, it ends all 3 of us." He drew a slow breath. "And I am going to do it anyway." She stared at him. "Why?" "You keep asking me that." A faint, exhausted, almost smile. "You asked me why I owned you, and I told you the truth, and it was an ugly truth. Now you ask me why I would free you, and I will tell you a truer one." He crossed the study to her, slowly, and this time he did not hesitate to touch. He took both her hands in both of his, the silver ring cold against her fingers, and he looked down at their joined hands, and then up at her face. "Because I have watched you love my son with a completeness I did not know a person contained. Because you turned this mausoleum into a place where a child laughs. Because you would not scream for my aunt, and you will not lower your eyes for me. And in 6 years, you have never once, not for a single hour, let this house make you smaller than you are. Because I am in love with you, Hermione Granger, and I have been for longer than I have let myself know. And a man does not keep the thing he loves in a book. He sets it free and prays it chooses to stay. The winter light lay across the study floor. Somewhere above them, faintly, they could hear Scorpius's voice, raised in some game of his own invention, happy, careless, safe. Hermione's eyes had filled, and she did not try to stop them. "And if I chose to go?" she asked, very quietly. "Once I was free. If I took the papers and the name, and I walked out of this house and never looked back, because I could, because you'd made it so I could, what then?" Something crossed his face, a flinch of pure pain quickly mastered. "Then you would go," he said, "and I would let you. That is what free means. I did not understand it for a long time. I thought love was a thing you held on to, the way this family holds on to everything, with both fists closed. I was wrong. Love is the opening of the fist." His jaw tightened. "If you go, I will grieve it for the rest of my life, and I will never once try to stop you, because the alternative is a thing I have already done, and I have to live with having done it, and I will not do it twice." Hermione took her hands from his. She saw the loss of it hit him, saw him brace to accept a rejection he had already decided he deserved. And then she reached up, slowly, and began to work loose the button at the cuff of her own left sleeve. His breath caught. She rolled the grey wool back, past her wrist, past the thin band of scar tissue where the serpent and its script of numbers had been burned into her skin 6 years ago in a firelit drawing room, and she held her marked wrist up between them in the winter light. "Do it," she said. Her voice shook and held. "Take me out of the book, not so that I can leave you, so that when I stay, and I'm going to stay, Draco, I decided somewhere between the fever and the kiss, and I am not going to unmake it, so that when I stay, it will be because I chose it, freely, with nothing on my wrist telling me I have to." Her tears spilled over, and she let them fall. "You said you would not have me come to you as a thing you own, then unmake the owning. And I will come to you as a free woman, exactly as you said, or I will not come at all. But I am telling you now, so that you do not spend one more hour being frightened of it. I will come." For a long moment, Draco Malfoy could not speak. Then he lifted her marked wrist to his mouth and pressed his lips against the scar, against the brand he had put there, against the 6 years of it. And she felt him shaking, and when he raised his head, his own eyes were wet and blazing and full of something she had never once seen in them in all the years she had known him, which was hope. The work of it took 11 days. They were the strangest 11 days of Hermione's life, the ordinary surface of the household carrying on exactly as before, the lessons and the meals and the frost walks, while underneath it, Draco moved through the delicate, lethal machinery of what he was doing. He was gone for hours in the East study with the door warded shut. He forged nothing himself. That would have left his hand on it. Instead, he did what a Malfoy could do that no one else could. He called in old debts, spoke to old friends in low, careful voices through the green flare of the flue, moved gold through channels that left no trail, and procured, from a former schoolmate turned records clerk who owed the family more than money, the amendment of a single line in a ledger and a death certificate bearing the correct seals, and a slim packet of papers naming a woman who had never existed and giving her the freedom to exist. He would not tell Hermione the details. "If it is ever unmade," he said, "you will be safer knowing as little as possible. Let the danger sit with me. I have earned the carrying of it. And on the 11th night he came to the library where she was waiting, and he laid the slim packet on the reading table between them, and he set beside it a small glass vial of colourless potion, and his hand was not entirely steady. "The discharge of the brand," he said, "of the vial. It will hurt." The mark was set with a great deal of malice, and it will not come away gently. But when it is gone, entry 407 is closed, and this, he touched the packet, is who you are. There is no going back from it, Hermione. Once the number closes, there is no clause to reopen it. If this is ever discovered, we run or we die. There is no third path. I need you to be certain, not of me, of this, of the leaving of everything you have ever been. Hermione looked at the vial, and at the packet, and at the man standing across the reading table in the candlelight, with 6 years of his family's cruelty behind him, and his whole future laid open and defenceless in front of her. The library was very quiet. The candles burned. The old parchment of 10,000 books breathed its dry, sweet dust into the air, and beyond the tall windows, the winter dark pressed close, and somewhere upstairs, a little boy slept with, for the first time in his short life, both halves of his bed occupied by hope. She reached across the table and took up the vial. "I have been certain," she said, "since a smudged phoenix." And she unstopped it and drank, and reached out her free hand for his to hold through what came next. And as the potion took hold, and the old brand on her wrist began, slowly, to burn its way out of her skin, and out of the ledger, and out of the world, she gripped his fingers hard and did not scream. Of course she did not scream. She had never once given anyone her screaming. But she let him see her face while it happened, let him witness every second of the unmaking he had bought at the price of everything. And when at last it was over, and the skin of her wrist was clear and unmarked, and entirely her own, she looked up at him through the tears standing in her eyes, and started helplessly, impossibly, in the candle-lit ruins of her whole old life, to laugh. She laughed until the laughing turned, without any seam between them, into weeping, and Draco came around the reading table and gathered her against him, and held her while it ran its course, and neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. Her wrist was clear. The skin was smooth and unmarked, and faintly pink where the brand had been, and every time she turned it over in the candlelight and looked at the bareness of it, a fresh wave took her, disbelief and grief, and a joy so enormous it hurt to hold. 6 years. 6 years she had worn that serpent and its numbers, and now there was only her own skin, her own pulse beating quiet and free beneath it, and she pressed the bare wrist to her mouth, and then, without deciding to, pressed it to his, holding her unmarked wrist against his jaw, as though he too needed to feel that it was gone. "It's gone," she whispered. "Draco, it's gone." "It's gone," he said, and his voice was not steady either, and his arms tightened around her, and for a long time they simply stood in the candle-warm library, in the dry, sweet breath of 10,000 books, holding each other in the aftermath of an unmaking that had cost him everything and given her back to herself. When at last she drew back to look at him, something had changed in the air between them. The old tension, the pull that had lived in every doorway touch and every held gaze since the night of the fever, was still there, but it had shed its fear. There was no cage left to be careful of, no ledger, no number, no owner, and no owned. There was only a woman standing free in a library that had once been her prison, and a man who had burned his own future to give her the ground she stood on, and the space between them, which had been for 6 years an unbridgeable distance, and then for 4 days a forbidden nearness, was now, suddenly, simply theirs to close, or not, as they chose. She chose. She reached up and laid her bare wrist against the side of his neck, her fingers sliding into his hair, and she drew his mouth down to hers. And this kiss was nothing like the desperate, salt-stung thing in the entrance hall. That one had been a confession wrenched out under threat. This one was a choice made in freedom, slow and certain and unafraid. And she felt him go still with the shock of it, and then feel the difference of it, the absence of the fear, the presence of the choosing. And she felt the moment he understood, and she felt him let go. His hands came up and framed her face with a tenderness that undid her. He kissed her slowly, thoroughly, learning her, and she kissed him back the same way, and the candles burned low around them, and the winter pressed dark against the tall windows, and there was no hurry in it at all, because for the first time in 6 years, there was nothing in the world telling either of them to stop. When they broke apart, they were both breathless. His forehead came down to rest against hers, and she could feel him trembling, and she realized he was holding himself back with an effort that showed in every line of him. "Hermione," he said low, "I want to be certain. I need you to know that nothing has to, that this changes nothing you don't want changed. You are free. You could take the papers tonight, and I would put you on a ship in the morning and ask for nothing. I have to say it. I have to be sure you know it." "I know it," she said. "You've said it a dozen ways, and I know it. That's exactly why I'm here." She drew back far enough to look at him, to let him see her whole face in the candlelight. "Do you understand? If there was still a brand on my wrist, I couldn't do this. I'd never know. I'd never be able to know whether it was me choosing or the law making me, and neither would you, and it would poison every moment of it for both of us forever. That's the gift you gave me. Not just freedom from them. Freedom to want you and mean it." She smiled unsteadily. "So, stop offering to put me on a ship. I'm not going anywhere. I'm exactly where I've decided to be." Something broke in his face. The last of it, the final guarded thing he had been holding since the first night. And he made a low sound and kissed her again, and this time neither of them held back. He led her by the hand up through the sleeping house. They went slowly and quietly past the portraits dozing in their gilt frames, past the schoolroom, past the nursery where they paused to listen at the door to the deep, even breathing of a boy asleep in a bed, no longer half empty, and then on to the east wing, to a chamber Hermione had never entered in 6 years of living under this roof. His rooms, high-ceilinged and shadowed, a fire burning low in the grate, tall windows giving onto the frost-white gardens and the enormous winter dark beyond. He turned to her just inside the door, and she saw the nerves in him, the strange shyness of a man who commanded armies, and did not know how to do this, how to be gentle with a thing he wanted so much, and she found it so unbearably dear that she reached up and began herself to unfasten the top button of his shirt, slowly, watching his eyes. "I don't know how to do this well," he admitted, very low. "I know how to do a great many things. I don't know how to. I have not, since Astoria. I have not." "I know," she said. "Neither have I. There hasn't exactly been opportunity." A breath of a laugh, and she felt his answer it against her, and some of the terrible tension eased out of both of them. "We'll be clumsy together. I'd rather be clumsy with you than perfect with anyone else." The fire settled in the grate. Outside, a fine snow had begun to fall, drifting past the tall dark windows in slow silver spirals, catching the low firelight as it fell, and the room was warm and shadowed, and entirely, finally, safe. What passed between them then was slow and quiet and reverent. He undressed her as though he were unwrapping something he could not believe he was permitted to hold, his hands unsteady on the small buttons of the grey wool, pausing to press his mouth to each new inch of her as it was uncovered. The curve of her shoulder, the wing of her collarbone, the pulse at the base of her throat. And she felt each touch travel through her like warmth, spreading through cold, stiffened hands held out to a fire. When he came to her bare left wrist, he stopped and lifted it and kissed the unmarked skin where the brand had been, slowly, thoroughly, as though he could kiss away the 6 years of it, and her breath caught on something between a sob and a sigh, and she drew his face back up to hers. She undressed him in turn and found the body beneath the fine clothes marked by its own history. Old scars, the pallor of a man who had not been happy in a long time, a heart she could feel hammering under her palm when she laid her hand flat against his chest, as fast and frightened and hopeful as her own. She pressed her mouth over that hammering heart and felt him shudder and felt his arms come around her, and there in the firelight, with the snow falling silver past the windows, they lay down together at last. It was not perfect. They were clumsy, exactly as she had promised. A bumped nose, a caught breath, a moment where they both laughed helplessly against each other's skin in the dark. And it was, precisely because of that, more perfect than any careful performance could have been. There was nothing owned in it, nothing owed, no law and no ledger, and no distance of marble between them. There were only 2 people who had come, by the longest and hardest of roads, to choose each other freely, moving together slow and unhurried in the low gold light, and every touch was a question asked and answered, and every silence was full. And when at last she came apart in his arms with his name on her lips and his mouth against her throat, she felt him follow her, felt the last of 6 years of held distance break and dissolve and pour out of him. And she held him through it, held him hard, this man who had owned her and then unmade the owning, and thought that she had never in her life felt so entirely, terrifyingly free. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the heavy coverlet, the fire burning low, the snow still falling past the tall windows, and neither of them spoke for a long while. His fingers moved slowly through her hair. Her bare wrist lay across his chest, over his heart, and he had covered it with his own hand, holding it there, and she felt the steady slowing of his heartbeat under her palm. "I keep waiting," she murmured at last, "to feel afraid. I've been afraid in this house every single day for 6 years, and I keep waiting for it to come back, and it doesn't." "It won't," he said against her hair. "Not here, not with me, not ever again." A pause. She felt him gather himself for something. "But we cannot stay, Hermione. You understand that. What I did, the ledger, the certificate, it will hold for a while. Months, perhaps. But records get audited. Deaths get questioned. Sooner or later, someone will look at entry 407 too closely. And when they do, I know." She had known it from the first, from the moment he said we run or we die. "When?" "Soon." His hand tightened over her wrist. "Before the spring audit. There is a way west. There has always been a way west for those with the gold to buy it. America does not recognize the subjugation law. They have taken in others. They will take in a woman with clean papers, and a widowed man, and his son. And no one there will ever look at your wrist and see anything but skin." He turned his head to look at her in the firelight, and his grey eyes were steady and certain and full of a future she had not let herself imagine in 6 years of learning to want nothing. "I have been quietly moving what I can for a week. It is nearly ready. In a matter of days, if you will have it, if you will have us, we walk out of this house and we do not come back, and we go somewhere the 3 of us can simply be a family with no one's name in any book at all." Hermione lay very still against him, the snow falling silver past the windows, the fire warm on her bare skin, and she thought of a little boy asleep down the corridor in a bed no longer half empty, and she thought of a bare wrist held over a beating heart, and she thought of the word family, spoken aloud in this cold house for the first time in 6 years, and not sounding cold at all. "Yes," she said. "God, yes. Take us west. Take us anywhere. Just take us together." And Draco Malfoy, in the firelight, in the snowfall, with the woman he loved lying free in his arms, smiled. A real smile, unguarded and young, the smile she had spent 6 years never once seeing, and gathered her closer and held on. They told Scorpius on the 3rd morning after, over breakfast, when the house was quiet and the servants were elsewhere. Draco did it himself. He had wanted to. It had mattered to him, Hermione understood, that this be his to give the boy and not hers, that this one thing come from the father. He knelt beside his son's chair the way he had learned to kneel, so that their eyes were level, and he told Scorpius that they were going on a journey, a long one across the sea, to a place where it was warm, where there was no law that decided who a person was allowed to be, where the 3 of them, and here he glanced up at Hermione and reached for her hand and drew her into it, where the 3 of them could live together, always as a family. Scorpius looked at his father and at Hermione and at their joined hands, and his small grave face worked through it slowly. He was 6. He understood more than a child should have had to understand, and less than the adults imagined. "Together," he said at last. "You and Papa and me, all of us, always?" "Always," Draco said. "And Miss Hermione won't have to go away?" The old fear surfaced in the boy's voice, the fear of every servant and governess who had passed through his short life and vanished, the fear that anyone he loved could be recalled or reassigned, or simply removed by a machinery he did not understand. She gets to stay, really stay, forever. Hermione knelt too, then on his other side, so that the boy was framed between the two of them, and she took his small cold hand in her bare one, wrist and all. "Forever, little owl," she said. "No one is ever going to take me away from you again. Not ever. That part is finished." And Scorpius, who had learned so young to hold his happiness carefully in case it smudged, in case it was taken, Scorpius flung his arms around both of them at once, one around his father's neck and one around Hermione's, drawing the three of them together into a single knot in the pale winter light. And he did not hold his happiness carefully at all. He let it out. He laughed and he cried at the same time, the way only children can, wholly and without shame. And over the top of his fair head, Hermione met Draco's eyes, and neither of them could speak, and neither of them needed to. The leaving took shape around them over the following days, quiet and careful and precise. Draco had spent his whole life in a house that measured wealth in the accumulation of things, and now he moved through it, undoing that arithmetic, with a cold, methodical purpose that Hermione found she could only watch in wonder. He was liquidating everything he could without drawing notice. Old vault holdings converted to portable gold, to gems, to bearer notes that could cross a border in a coat lining. Heirlooms that could not be sold quietly were simply left behind, and he left them without a backward glance. This man of an old and grasping family, opening his fist and letting the whole weight of it fall. He arranged the passage through the same discreet western channel that had smuggled others out before them. A merchant ship out of a Welsh port, a captain who did not ask questions of passengers who paid in gold, a crossing of some weeks, and at the far end of it, a country that would look at their clean papers and see nothing but a small grieving family come to start again. "We go as the Blacks," he told her one night in his rooms, the papers spread on the coverlet between them. "Not Malfoy. Malfoy is a name they watch. Black is old and scattered, and half its lines are extinct. No one will look twice at a widowed Mr. Black and his second wife and his son." He touched the topmost paper. "You are Jean Black. I chose it because it's my mother's name," Hermione said softly. She had told him that once, in one of the long candlelit hours after the boy was abed. Her parents' names, her whole erased history, the life the war had taken from her. That he had remembered, that he had reached into the small store of what she had given him and chosen this, undid something in her chest. "You remembered." "I remember everything you have ever told me," he said simply. "I have not had a great deal else worth keeping." They were to leave on the last night of the month, in the dark of the moon, when the wards would be at their lowest ebb, and the roads their emptiest. And in the days before it, an unbearable tension took up residence in the house. Not the frozen tension of the old days, but the strung-tight, breath-held tension of people counting down to a single irreversible act, jumping at every changed pressure in the wards, every raised voice among the servants, every owl that came to the great cold windows. Because it was not done yet. Because the ledger with its amended lines still sat in a ministry archive in London waiting to be audited, and any morning could bring the inspector back, and they all knew it, and none of them said it aloud in front of the boy. On the second to last night, it nearly came apart. Hermione was in the nursery, packing the small case of the few things Scorpius would be allowed to bring. A favourite book, the smudged phoenix, a wooden dragon worn smooth with handling, when she felt the wards change. Not the official pressure of an inspection. Something subtler and worse. The light, testing brush of someone probing the house's defences from outside, quietly, the way a thief tries a series of locked doors. Her blood ran cold. She went to the window and looked down through the frost-glazed glass into the black gardens. And there, at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the winter dark, she saw the faint blue glimmer of a wand held low, and the shape of a man behind it, watching the house. She found Draco in the east study. She did not speak. She only took his hand and drew him to the window and pointed and watched his face go still and lethal. "How long has he been there?" Draco said, very quietly. "I don't know. I felt him try the wards a moment ago." "Ministry?" "I couldn't see the colours. He's too far. But who else creeps up on a house in the dark, Draco?" Her hand had tightened on his. "If they've audited the ledger early, if they know, then we would not be watched. We would be raided." His jaw was tight, the muscle leaping, but his voice stayed level, and she saw him thinking, fast and cold, the way she imagined he thought in the councils of the regime he served. A single watcher, at night, testing the wards quietly and not entering. That is not an arrest. That is reconnaissance. Someone suspects and is gathering proof before they move. Which means his eyes came up to hers, and there was a terrible calm in them. Which means we do not have days. We have hours. We go tonight. Tonight? Draco, the ship isn't. The crossing isn't arranged until the ship sails on the tide, whether we are aboard or not. The passage is bought. What we lose by going early is only the margin of safety, and the margin of safety just walked out of the trees with a wand in his hand. He was already moving, pulling the packed bags from the study cupboard where he had hidden them, his movements swift and sure. Wake the boy. Dress him warm. Tell him it's an adventure, and tell him he must be brave and quiet. And Hermione. He caught her arm as she turned and pulled her back and kissed her hard and quick and fierce. "Whatever happens in the next hour, however it goes, I am glad. Do you understand me? Whatever happens, I am glad I did it. I would rather have 3 months of this and lose everything than another 6 years of what I was. Now go. Go." She went. She woke the boy gently and dressed him in his warmest things. And she was proud past speaking of how he rose to it, sleepy and frightened and 6 years old. And yet, when she told him they had to be brave and quiet, that the adventure was starting early, that Papa needed him to be the best and bravest he had ever been, he set his small jaw exactly the way his father did, and he nodded, and he did not make a sound. She caught up his small case. She wrapped him in a dark cloak, and she carried him down through the sleeping house on her hip, with his face pressed into her neck, past the dozing portraits, past the cold marble, past 6 years of her life, toward the small side door where Draco waited with the bags and the gold and the papers that would make them someone new. He had a hand on the door. His face, when he turned to her, was white and set and alive. "The watchers still at the tree line," he breathed. "We go out the north way, through the old servants' passage, into the wood on the far side, away from him. There's a port key. unregistered, it cost a fortune. It will take us to within a mile of the port. From the wood to the port quay is perhaps 400 yards of open ground in the dark. If he sees us on it, he'll raise the alarm, and then it becomes a race we may not win. He looked at the woman he loved, and the son he had almost never let himself love, bundled together in the dark of the door. "Are you ready?" Hermione shifted the boy higher on her hip and reached out and took Draco's hand, her bare wrist showing pale in the dark, unmarked, her own. "I've been ready for 6 years," she said. "Open the door." And Draco Malfoy drew a breath and tightened his hand around hers and eased open the door onto the black and frozen winter garden, onto the 400 yards of open ground, onto the last desperate stretch of the longest road either of them had ever walked. And the three of them stepped out together into the cold and the dark and the falling snow and ran. The cold hit them like a wall. The snow was falling harder now, thick and silent, and it swallowed the shapes of the ragged topiary and turned the whole vast garden into a shifting grey nothing. And Hermione's breath tore white from her lungs as they ran, the boy a warm, heavy weight against her chest, his small arms locked around her neck, his face buried and his body rigid with the effort of being brave and quiet, exactly as he had been asked. They kept to the deep shadow of the yew hedge along the north wall, away from the tree line where the watchers stood, and the snow was a mercy and a curse, both. It hid them, but it slowed them, dragging at their feet, and every footfall broke the frozen crust with a crunch that sounded to Hermione's straining ears, loud as a shout in the enormous winter hush. Draco went first, a bag over each shoulder, his wand held low and dark in his hand, and he moved through the garden he had known his whole life, like a shadow moving through itself, and she followed exactly in his tracks, and the great black bulk of the house fell away behind them into the falling snow. The old servants' passage was a gap in the north wall, half hidden behind a fallen section of stone, and Draco eased them through it one at a time. First the bags, then Hermione and the boy squeezing sideways through the narrow cold gap, then himself. And then they were out beyond the wards entirely, out into the black wild wood that bordered the Malfoy lands. And for one moment they stopped in the dark under the snow-laden trees and simply breathed. "Is he still there?" Hermione whispered. "The Watcher." Draco was very still, listening, reading the night the way she had watched him read a room. "I can't tell. The wood breaks the sight lines. But he can't have seen us go through the wall. The yews covered us." His hand found her shoulder in the dark. "The port quays 400 yards ahead, at the old boundary stone, past the edge of the trees. And that last stretch is open. Common land, no cover, white with snow. If he's moved round to the north, if he's watching the wood at all..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. They went on through the black trees, slower now, careful of every root and stone beneath the snow, and Scorpius, who had been so brave for so long, began at last to shake against her, the cold and the fear and the strangeness of it all finally reaching him. And Hermione pressed her mouth to his ear and breathed him steady. "Nearly there, little owl, nearly there. You're being so brave. Your papa is so proud of you, and so am I. And in just a little while we're going to be somewhere warm, I promise, somewhere with sun, and none of this cold will ever be able to reach you again. Just a little longer. Just be brave a little longer." And he nodded against her and held on and was brave. The trees thinned. Ahead, through the last screen of trunks, Hermione could see the open ground, a long white slope of common land, unbroken snow ghostly under the black sky. And there, at the far edge of it, the dark hunched shape of the old boundary stone, where their whole future waited in the form of a single unregistered portkey. 400 yards of open white. Nothing to hide behind, nothing at all. Draco crouched at the tree line, and Hermione crouched beside him, and they looked out across that impossible open distance, and behind them, faint and far, came a sound that stopped both their hearts. The crunch of a footstep in frozen snow, back the way they had come, in the wood. The Watcher had moved. The Watcher was in the trees behind them. "Go," Draco breathed. "Now. Straight across. Don't stop. Don't look back. Get to the stone and put your hand on it. And take the boy and do not wait for me. I'm not leaving without you. You are not leaving without me. I am 3 steps behind you. But you carry the child, and the child goes first. That is not a discussion." His eyes in the dark were fierce and certain. "On 3. Ready. 1, 2. They broke from the trees and ran. Out across the open white, running full out now, no more caution possible, the snow dragging at their legs. The boy clutched hard against Hermione's chest, and behind them, at once, a shout went up in the wood. A man's voice, raised, calling out, and then the crack of a spell splitting the frozen air, a bolt of light that seared past them and struck the snow to their left in a hiss of steam. And Draco spun as he ran and threw a shield behind them without breaking stride, a shimmering wall that caught the next bolt and shattered it, and roared, "Run!" And Hermione ran as she had never run in her life, the boundary stone growing closer through the falling snow, 200 yards, 150. Another spell shrieking past her ear close enough to feel the heat of it. The boy screaming now into her neck. Draco falling back a pace to shield them both, walking backwards through the snow with his wand up and blazing, catching bolt after bolt, buying her the distance with his own body between her and the light. 100 yards, 50. The stone loomed up dark and squat and snow-capped, and she flung out her bare hand toward it, her fingers spread, the unmarked wrist pale in the spell light. "Draco!" He was 10 feet back, still shielding, still walking backward, and a bolt got through, clipped his shoulder, spun him half around, and he staggered. And Hermione's hand closed on the freezing stone, and she screamed his name into the snow and the dark, screamed it, she who had never screamed for anyone. And she reached back with her free hand across the impossible closing distance, and his hand caught hers, cold and hard and sure, his fingers locking around her bare wrist over the place where the brand had been. And she felt the great sick lurch of the portkey take hold behind her navel, felt the world seize and fold, and the last thing she saw of Malfoy Manor was the snow falling silver through the beam of a stranger's wand. And then the ground was gone, and the light was gone, and the cold was gone, and they were falling, the 3 of them locked together and falling through a roaring nothing. And then salt air, and the cry of gulls, and grey dawn light and hard wet cobblestones beneath them as they landed in a tangle a mile from a Welsh port with the sea wind in their faces and the world made new. They made the ship on the morning tide. The captain asked no questions of the pale, exhausted family who came aboard at first light with gold in hand and a sleeping child and the look of people who had run a long way. He had carried such passengers before and would again, and he only took their coin and showed them to a narrow cabin below the waterline and told them the crossing would take the better part of 3 weeks. And Hermione lay on the narrow bunk with Scorpius sleeping heavy and safe in the curve of her body, and she cleaned and bound the burn on Draco's shoulder with hands that would not quite stop shaking, and neither of them spoke until it was done. And then he caught her trembling hands in his and held them still against his chest, and they looked at each other in the swaying lantern light of a ship carrying them west, away, out, free. "We did it," she whispered. She could not quite believe the words as she said them. "Draco, we did it." "We did it," he said. And then the calm broke in him at last, all of it, 3 months and 6 years of it, and he pulled her against him carefully around the sleeping child and pressed his face into her hair and shook, and she held him. And outside the small salt-crusted porthole, the coast of Britain fell slowly away into the grey morning mist and was gone. The crossing was long and the sea was often rough, and it was the happiest 3 weeks of Hermione Granger's life. They were no one on that ship. They were a Mr. and Mrs. Black and their boy, and no portrait watched them, and no ledger held them, and no cold marble corridor stretched between one person and another. Scorpius, who had spent his whole life in the vast silence of a house that frightened him, discovered the deck and the rigging and the endless grey heave of the sea, and he ran and shouted and laughed until he was hoarse, and the sailors taught him knots and let him ring the bell, and every night he fell asleep between his father and Hermione in the narrow bunk, exhausted and salt-crusted and radiantly, completely happy, a child at last simply being a child. And Draco changed on that ship in the open salt air day by day, the way the coldness had first thawed in the castle, only more so, more completely, as though each mile of ocean between him and the house he had been raised in stripped away another layer of the frost that place had grown over him. He smiled easily now. He laughed. She heard him laugh for the first time on the second day out at something the boy said, a startled bark of it that seemed to surprise him as much as her. And then he did it again and again, until it stopped being a surprise and became simply a thing he did. He took Hermione's hand on the deck in the open daylight where anyone could see and did not care who saw. He was becoming, before her eyes, the man he might have been if the war had gone another way, if the law had never been written, if the whole grasping cold machinery of his family had never closed its fist around him. A man free to be gentle, free to be glad, free to love out loud. On the last night of the crossing, they stood together at the rail while Scorpius slept and watched the lights of the American coast rise glittering out of the dark ahead and the future with them. "I've been thinking about what we'll do," Hermione said. The wind pulled at her hair. His arm was warm around her. "There, when we land, I could teach, a real school or tutoring, There must be work for someone who reads 11 languages. And you? I'll learn something honest, Draco said. I have a great deal of unlearning to do first, but I'll learn something honest. He was quiet a moment, watching the lights grow. I keep thinking of my father, of what he would say if he could see me now. Running to a Muggle-tolerant country with a Muggle-born woman I set free, and his grandson, and nothing left of the family fortune but what I could carry. A faint smile. He would say I had brought the family to ruin. And what do you say? He turned to look at her, and in the light coming up off the approaching city, his face was open and unguarded and young, and there was no frost left in it anywhere at all. I say, I brought it to life, he said, for the first time in 100 years. He lifted her bare left wrist to his lips, the way he had that first night after the unmaking, and kissed the unmarked skin and held it against his cheek. You have no idea, Hermione, what you have given me. You loved my son when I could not. You would not let me be the thing I was raised to be. And you chose me, freely, with nothing on your wrist telling you to. You chose me anyway, after everything I did to you. I do not deserve it. I have stopped trying to deserve it. I am only going to spend the rest of my life being grateful for it. Hermione turned in the circle of his arm and reached up and drew his face down to hers and kissed him, slow and sure and free. With the salt wind around them and the lights of a new country rising, and their son asleep and safe below, and the whole cold, cruel world they had escaped falling away behind them into the dark of the sea. And when they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his and breathed him in, and thought that 6 years ago she had knelt on a cold floor in a firelit room and sworn service under a curse, and that she had never once, in all the darkness that followed, dared to imagine that the same man who had put her there would one day burn down his entire world to set her free, and that she would stand at the rail of a ship in the morning with his arms around her and choose gladly, with her whole unbound heart, to spend her life at his side. The ship came in with the dawn. They carried Scorpius down the gangplank between them in the pink new light, still half asleep, one small hand in his father's and one in Hermione's. And they stepped off onto the solid ground of a free country as the sun came up gold over the water and the gulls wheeled and cried overhead. No number, no ledger, no cold marble at their backs, only the three of them together, and a whole warm, unwritten life ahead, and the light coming up over everything, over the harbour and the strange new city, and their three joined shadows stretching long across the boards toward the morning. Are we there? Scorpius murmured, waking, blinking up at the light. Is this the warm place? Is this where we get to stay forever? Hermione looked at Draco over the boy's fair head, and Draco looked back at her, and they were both smiling, and neither of them could stop. Yes, little owl, she said, and tightened her hand around his, and turned all three of them toward the rising sun and the free life waiting in it. This is the place. This is where we stay forever. And they walked up into the morning together and did not look back.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. I want to tell you why I wrote this story. When I write, I think a lot about one question. Can love be real if it does not start free? Draco owned Hermione. He put her name in a book. He made her kneel. That is a terrible thing, and I did not want to hide it or make it pretty, so I gave myself one rule. Law could not come before freedom. Freedom had to come first. There is a small moment I love in this story. A little boy draws phoenix for his father, but he smudges one wing, and he hides the drawing because he is afraid. He does not want to disappoint his father with a mistake. That small moment is the heart of the whole story, because we all do this. We hide our smudged parts. We think we are too broken to be loved, but the father looks at the smudge and he says, "That is not a mistake, that is the best part." That is the message I want to leave with you. Your broken parts are not the end of your story. The people who truly love you will not run from your smudges. They will kneel down. They will look you in the eye, and sometimes they will burn their whole world down just to set you free. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself.